read both volumes of Mouse, and I think you were also given a short excerpt from Marianne Hirsch's work on postmemory, and I'll be talking about that soon as well. I wanted to start by going back to a question which I think you heard a little bit about in your previous lecture about the Holocaust and the crisis of representation. And I think Professor Kaganovsky mentioned to you probably the names Theodor Adorno, who you might not have heard of before, and Elie Wiesel, who you probably have heard of before. I'm going to add one more name in there, which is Chaim Kaplan. So what I think what this discussion has been about is about the possibility of depicting or representing the Holocaust in literature or in other art forms. And probably one of the most famous things that ever has been said about that question is Adorno's "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." And then Wiesel in 1975 went even a step further in saying there is no such thing as a literature of the Holocaust, nor can there be. The very expression is a contradiction in terms. Auschwitz negates any form of literature as it defies all systems, all doctrines. This is, of course, a statement by someone who himself wrote a lot of works of literature about the Holocaust. So there's something a bit paradoxical there going on. But this has been a longstanding discourse. And what's interesting, what I wanted to point out here by adding Chaim Kaplan, is it actually goes all the way back to the moment of the events themselves. So Chaim Kaplan was a resident of Warsaw, kept a diary during the first few years of the Second World War until he was killed by the Nazis. And right off the bat, he wrote in one of his very first diary entries, "It is beyond my pen to describe the destruction," right? And so in some ways, this whole question of whether the Holocaust can be represented is one that goes back to those who are experiencing the events immediately. And I think it's an important discussion. I would say, you know, despite that, as I mentioned with Wiesel, it's been discussed quite a bit. It's been written about quite a bit in all forms of literature. And also, I would want to add that I don't think that there's something specific about the Holocaust that challenges representation. I would say that you could probably say the same things about the Armenian genocide, about transatlantic slavery, about other traumatic histories which kind of defy our imagination and defy our ability to represent it and depict it in literature and art, even as we also feel compelled to try and to do that nonetheless. When we come to Mouse, I think Mouse adds a couple of new challenges, and I just want to put these out here at the beginning, and then we'll come back to it later. First of all, if poetry and literature are barbaric after Auschwitz, what would a comic book be, right? What does it mean to try to depict an event like this that has been declared all but unrepresentable and to do it in comic book form? I think that adds some new questions that we might want to discuss. The other thing is that those three figures that I mentioned a moment ago, Kaplan, Adorno, and Wiesel, are all either survivors or in Adorno's case, exiles, someone he escaped from Nazi Germany early on. So not technically a survivor, but someone who was of that generation of the victims and survivors. Kaplan was a victim, not a survivor. Wiesel was a survivor. So what happens, though, as we move further away from the events in time? Questions of generation come in, right? And so that's one of the obvious points about Mouse that I want to emphasize in this category of post-memory is how do we represent the Holocaust now from a generational distance? I think that's one of the things that Mouse asks us to think about. And that brings up questions of memory, the sort of retrospective look on the events, and also what Hirsch will call post-memory. So here's an outline of the lecture, and I'm going to be approaching it, kind of reapproaching Mouse now through the lens of what is called memory studies, which is a prominent way of thinking about the Holocaust, but also other events, not just traumatic ones, but there has been a lot of work, especially on traumatic histories and the memory of traumatic history. So I want to first kind of go over this question: what do we mean when we talk about memory? What are the different kinds of memory? Which you'll see, I think, are relevant to Mouse. I then want to turn to Hirsch and her notion of post-memory, try to work our way through that a bit, and then finally turn to Mouse itself directly. So what is memory? And here I'm drawing on one of the most prominent memory scholars today, Jan Assmann, who together with his partner, Aleida Assmann, have done some of the most influential work in the field of memory studies recently. They're both German scholars. So Jan Assmann writes, Memory is knowledge of the past with an identity index. It is knowledge about oneself, be it as an individual or as a member of a family, a community, a nation, or a cultural and religious tradition. Remembering is a realization of belonging, even a social obligation. So what distinguishes memory, according to these scholars, from simple history or simple knowledge is the fact that when we remember, we are also we are establishing a kind of belonging. We are establishing a kind of identity, right? We remember, as I'll say in a moment, as members of particular groups. And that memory helps create the groups, and especially it helps create our belonging to the groups and our sense of self. So Jan Assmann distinguishes three fundamental kinds of memory. And I just want you to look at the far right side of this chart, and I'll go through these: individual memory, communicative memory, and cultural memory. So what are these? Individual memory is the most familiar form of memory. This is, I think, what most people would think about when they think about memory. It's the memory that I have, right, that you have, that we individually have, that's located in our brains, and scientists are trying to study exactly where it's located. It's also located in our bodies, as I'll suggest. And I think, as you can see, in mouse as well. All of these categories will come back in mouse. So individual experience is not shareable, right? What you remember is your own particular experience, and it's linked to your individual lifespan. When you pass away, when you die, your memory in some sense goes with you. So what are some of these examples of an individual memory? It's remembering who you are, right? Without a sense of memory, we have no sense of identity, right? If you can't remember what you did yesterday, how do you know you're the same person, right? How do you establish a kind of continuity in time? That's what memory contributes to individual identity. But there's also this bodily memory, right? How do you ride a bike? How do you swim? These are things that are kind of encoded in your very body that you simply know how to do because your body remembers them. Right? So that's another form of individual memory. And traumatic experiences, like the kind that we'll talk about in relationship to the Holocaust, but you could talk about in other histories as well, are also very individualized memories, at least at first. But even individual memory is in fact shaped by social factors, right? So if you think about your very earliest personal memories, can you really be sure that they're your memories alone, or if you have not actually been influenced by the stories that, for example, your parents have told you, right? How do you distinguish between what you really remember by yourself and what you remember by virtue of the kind of input that you got when your mother says, oh, you used to, ride your bike down this street, or what, you used to do this as a baby, those sorts of things. So even individual memory is already a kind of social memory. But the Assmanns then, drawing on a French sociologist named Maurice Halbwachs, distinguish a very particular kind of social memory, which they call communicative memory. What Halbwachs said argued was that memory is actually made possible by social frameworks, that we never remember alone. We remember because we are members of groups. I liken this a little bit to the question of language, right? You can't speak if you don't have a language, and that language is not yours alone. That language is a shared social phenomena. And it's the same with remembering. Halbwachs is basically saying we have a social language, or really social languages of remembering, that allow us to remember things, and they come by virtue of our belonging to different groups. And this is true, I think, even for bodily memory, right? If you think about, how we all eat at the table, the kinds of, norms and expectations for how to use a fork and a knife or not use a fork and a knife, these are shaped socially, even though they're encoded in our bodies. The most, I think, the clearest form of communicative memory, the easiest one to grasp, is probably family memory. Right? So the kinds of stories that are passed down within a family. And you see why I'm bringing this up, I think, when we think about mouse. And so I have this silly photo of this beautiful, happy family that I took from the Recipe Geek website. And it's just to give you a sense of, right, the family dinner table as one of the scenes in which stories are told and communicative memory is transmitted. And what the Assmanns say is that this particular form of memory is usually linked to a generational structure of 3 generations, right? So you hear stories from your grandparents, you hear stories from your parents, and those memories get passed down within the family, and the scope of them, the lifespan of them is usually 80 to 100 years, they say. I think that's actually being stretched as people are living longer, and some people know their great-grandparents as well, so maybe it's even 4 generations. So that's not a precise figure there, but it gives you a sense. There are certain things that you know by virtue of belonging to a family that get passed down within a family, and then after a few generations disappear, right? I know nothing about what my family was doing in the 19th century, and probably you guys don't either, right? And so you can see there's a kind of limit to that communicative memory. So does that mean everything else just passes into history? No, the Osmans say. There's a third form of memory that they call cultural memory. And this is memory that gets externalized in various kinds of cultural artifacts. So texts like Maus or other things you've been reading, monuments like the Lincoln Memorial or the Washington Monument, or here the Parthenon in Greece, in museums, in various kinds of rituals. So what are examples of this cultural memory? Well, nations have cultural memory, right? We all remember in a certain sense the American Revolution or the Civil War. And I say we remember it and not just know it, because I think it's an identity, if we're American at least, right? It's an identity constituting form of knowledge, right? It's different to know what happened in the American Revolution than it might be for most of us, perhaps not Professor Kaganovsky, to know about the Russian Revolution or something like that. You see what I mean? It's not just a historical knowledge, it's historical knowledge that constitutes who we think of ourselves as being, as part of a collective, a national collective. This Greek example here in the image is, I think, what I would call a civilizational memory. Many people think of themselves as part of Western civilization. We trace Western civilization back to the ancient Greeks, and the Parthenon, right, is an example of that. So if you see yourself as part of that tradition, this is part of your cultural memory. And I think religious memory is here maybe the best example, or another really good example, right? If you're Jewish, you do the Passover Seder, you say, we were once slaves in the land of Egypt, right? We connect ourselves in memory, and it's not just knowledge of what happened, it's actually constituting who we are as the Jewish people. Or if you're Catholic and you go to Mass and you take part in certain rituals, you're not just remembering the Passion, right, or the life of Jesus. You're actually you're allowing that to help constitute your identity as a Christian or as a Catholic. So this is what's called cultural memory. And cultural memory can really come in almost any form, right? Almost any form of cultural production, of social or political activity can contribute to the construction of cultural memory. So here's a Holocaust example. In Israel, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, I think it's like 10 in the morning, 11 in the morning, a siren sounds, everybody, at least everybody who's Jewish, stops what they're doing, turns off their car, gets out on the highway here, and just stands in silence for 3 minutes, right? So even silence can be a medium of cultural memory, I guess is what I'm trying to suggest here. So anything, including in our case today, a comic book, is also a form of cultural memory. So let's now think about post-memory. And the question here is really what happens to, first of all, what happens to what the Osmans called communicative memory, this intrafamilial transmission across generations under traumatic circumstances. It's a term coined by Marianne Hirsch. I'll introduce her in a moment, and done specifically in the relationship to Maus. It was partly through reading Maus that she came to this idea, as I'll explain. And if you remember back again to this slide I just showed you of communicative memory again, the beautiful family, happy conversation at dinner, and then think about that in relationship to what you've just read in Maus, right? Something here is not quite the same in the Spiegelman household, right? You see the same dinner time or kitchen conversations going on, but they're no longer this kind of happy transmission of funny stories from your childhood. All of a sudden, as this image on the right shows you, right, we're talking about family conversations that are always taking place against the backdrop of Auschwitz, right? And Spiegelman represents that for us here with the reference to the crematorium chimney, right? So the conversations that are going on in the Spiegelman household are different from those in, let's say, ordinary, non-traumatized families, if there are such things. And so this is the question out of which post-memory comes, right? What happens to communicative memory after trauma, right? And this is what Marianne Hirsch, I think, set out to think about. And Marianne Hirsch herself is the child of Holocaust survivors. And in fact, she's from the exact same generation as Art Spiegelman. And her story in some ways is sort of similar. I mean, many differences, of course, too. It's similar in that they're born very close to each other. They're both born in Europe, but emigrate with their families later to the United States. So she was born in Romania. Her parents were from Czernowitz, which was a really interesting, very multilingual region of Romania, now part of the Ukraine, where a lot of very famous Jewish intellectuals came from. Paul Celan is one of them, Dan Pegis, really some really important Jewish writers and Holocaust surviving writers come from Czernowitz. Her family emigrated to the US, and she went on to study comparative literature at Brown University, and she is today a leading feminist scholar of Holocaust literature, of memory, of visual culture, and other forms of literature as well. And as I said a moment ago, she was inspired by Mauss to come up with this notion of post-memory, which I'll define for you in a moment, or we'll look at her definition in a moment. I wanted to put up the book covers here because you can see just from these covers, on the one hand, how important photography is for her. And that comes up in Mauss as well. So photography is one of the mediums through which post-memory is transmitted within the family, she argues, family photographs. But she's also really interested in the way that artists use photographs in their work. And that's what some of these examples are. And interestingly, if you look at the cover on the right-hand side, you'll see that artists have in turn been inspired by her concept of post-memory to create works called post-memory, as in this example by Lori Novak, who's a New York-based artist who does a lot of work with photography. So what is post-memory? This is, I think, it's a dense, but I think probably the best definition that she gives, and hopefully some of you have had a chance to read that. Post-memory describes the relationship that the generation of those who witnessed cultural, generation after, excuse me, it's all the pictures here are blocking my text. I never know how to do that. Let me, okay, now I just see Professor Kaganowski, but that's fine. Post-memory describes the relationship that the generation after those who witnessed cultural or collective trauma bears to the experience of those who came before. Experiences they remember only by means of the stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. But these experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and affectively as to seem to constitute memories in their own right. Memory's connection to the past is thus not actually mediated by recall, as in regular memory, right? But by imaginative investment, projection, and creation. There's a lot going on actually in that passage, and if we were in a kind of smaller group, we could kind of go through this closely together, sentence by sentence or word by word, and sort of bring things out of it. But I think hopefully at least the key points are clear, and then I'm going to go through some of the questions that I think arise from this definition in the next few slides. So we're talking about a relationship across generations that is marked by trauma to the first generation and somehow transmitted to the second generation. And that transmission is, again, not just happy stories that are being told, but is some way marking those to whom it is transmitted, in this case, the second generation, the children, so deeply that it becomes something like memory. And yet it's a memory which is not recall. You weren't actually there, so you can't remember it in that sense, and therefore is going to rely on your imagination, on your projection into what you think happened, right? That you have to, in some ways, create your image of that past, even as it's being transmitted to you. So a first question I think that arises, it's a totally legitimate question, is post-memory memory? Whoops. Is post-memory really memory? And she's a little bit cagey about this, but I think it's a definition that for me at least kind of makes sense. Post-memory is distinguished from memory by generational distance and from history by deep personal connection. So if you think back to that Osman definition of memory, right, knowledge of the past with an identity index, in that sense, post-memory, I think, really does fall within the scope of memory, because the idea here is that the memories that you've inherited, that your parents have somehow transmitted to you, are so significant that they have really marked you in an identity creating way. They really are deeply personal, right? So it's not just history. If you were a child of survivors of a traumatic event, your relationship to that event is not just like anybody learning history in a school book. It's more personal, right? It's more emotionally and affectively loaded. At the same time, you can't say it's simply memory because you don't have that direct recall. You are separated generationally from what happened. So it's somehow in between memory and history. And I think that's not a bad way to think about it. But it has that deep personal connection, which makes it memory-like, at least according to the way that people like the Ostmans and other scholars in memory studies would think about memory. So how is it transmitted? Now, it is obviously transmitted through stories. So even if the stories are not happy stories, in that, in that stereotypical example I gave you before, but are sad or disturbing or traumatic stories, certainly it's passed down in stories. And yet what a lot of children of Holocaust survivors say, and survivors themselves, is the survivors didn't always talk about those events, right? A lot of people remained silent. They didn't want to, or they couldn't tell their children what had happened. And again, I don't think this is specific to the Holocaust, but you hear it a lot in relationship to the Holocaust. So despite that, could it still be transmitted if you haven't heard the stories, right? And I think this is important. And here Hirsch is quoting from Eva Hoffman, another second generation writer, wrote a book called After Such Knowledge, I believe is what she's quoting here. And Hoffman wrote, "In my home, as in so many others, the past broke through in the sounds of nightmares, the idioms of sighs and illness, of tears and acute aches that were the legacy of the damp attic and of the conditions my parents endured in their hiding," right? So what you get here is a sense that the past is not only transmitted in narratives and stories, but it's transmitted in a bodily way, affectively, through various kinds of symptoms on the body, illnesses, sighs, nightmares, all of these things that are in some sense produced by the traumatic event, not experienced directly by the children, but passed down to the children in these indirect, but often very bodily, corporeal ways. We'll see an example of that, in fact, or more than one example of that, possibly in Mouse as well. Is memory just for family members, right? So after Hirsch coined this term, it became incredibly popular, right? So if you Google post-memory, or if you look in any kind of scholarly context for post-memory, you'll see that this term has been unbelievably influential. And I think rightly so, because it describes an experience which, again, is very broadly shared, not just among Holocaust survivors, but among survivors of other kinds of traumatic events as well. So people started to wonder, do you have to be, a family member to experience post-memory? What about, I'm not a family member, but this has affected me so powerfully, right? The Holocaust has been so important to me, despite not having it in my family, as it were. Am I also part of the post-memory generation? This is kind of a long quotation, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just to bring out what she's trying to distinguish here. She says, okay, look, it's true that people who are not family members can be deeply affected, and even in an identity constituting way, by events that they don't have within their family. And yet there's still a difference between that and what happens in a family. So she distinguishes here between what she calls familial post-memory and affiliative post-memory. Familial post-memory is the kind that's represented in Mouse. It's when you are the direct descendant of someone who passed through this kind of traumatic event. Affiliative post-memory is a more indirect form for those who share a certain generational position, as she says, with people who are familially members of the post-memory generation and somehow identify with it, somehow share that position with those members. So we may not have the same experiences as Art Spiegelman, but by virtue of all of the books and films and stories, et cetera, that we've heard about the Holocaust, we may affiliate to it, right? We may identify with that story, even though it's not directly part of our story. And that's what Hirsch would call affiliative post-memory. I'll say that all of these things are somewhat controversial and open for debate, right, and interpretation. Not everybody agrees with her idea of post-memory. Not everybody would agree with this notion of affiliative post-memory, but we kind of put it out there and see how it works, I think, in particular contexts. So I've already started to suggest an answer for this, but is post-memory just for the Holocaust? And Hirsch is pretty clear that it's not. And she talks about it as a more general phenomenon. I think this is important. Postmemory characterizes the experience of those who grew up dominated by narratives that preceded their birth, whose own belated stories are evacuated by the stories of the previous generation, shaped by traumatic events that can be neither understood nor recreated. I have developed this notion in relation to children of Holocaust survivors, but I believe it may usefully describe other second generation memories of cultural or collective traumatic events and experiences. So she's putting out a more general concept, and I can think of a lot of different cases in which I think this is relevant. And one of the first though that came to my mind was certainly the question of slavery, and in particular the novel Beloved by Toni Morrison. I don't know if anybody's read that. Hopefully some of you have. I know it's sometimes now taught in high schools. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it. It's really a kind of amazing book. And so what Hirsch writes when she publishes this second book on postmemory, The Generation of Postmemory, is that in fact, she wasn't only inspired by Spiegelman's mouse when she was coming up with this idea, she was actually also inspired by a reading she heard of Morrison's Beloved the year before the novel was published. Morrison came to Dartmouth, where Marianne Hirsch was teaching at the time, read this yet to be published novel, Beloved, and this is what Hirsch writes. Toni Morrison's novel Beloved dramatized the haunting transgenerational reach of trauma, and it showed me that latency need not mean forgetting or oblivion. Generations after slavery, Morrison was able to convey its impacts and effects more powerfully than contemporary accounts. How is trauma transmitted across generations, I began to wonder. How is it remembered by those who did not live it or know it in their own bodies? This is the story of Denver in the novel, as it is the story of Spiegelman's Artie. In some ways, it is my story as well. And if you've read Beloved, you'll remember that Denver is the daughter of Setha, the main figure, who was born literally on the border between slavery and freedom, right? Her mother has just run away from the plantation where she has been enslaved. And she gives birth to Denver just after she has sort of crossed the border to the north. And so it's in some ways the most literal kind of post-memory relationship you can have. But I think Hirsch's point is also that the novel itself, in giving us this history in such a powerful way many generations later, is also itself kind of a work of post-memory, because the legacies of slavery have lived on, right, over the last 150 years after the end of slavery in ways that I think we all are familiar with. So there are other examples. You could talk about post-memory in relationship to the Armenian genocide, other things as well, but here's my one example for today. And just a couple more questions. I think this is a really interesting one that I've been thinking a lot about. Is post-memory just for the families of victims, right? So Art Spiegelman is the son of two survivors of the Holocaust, two victims of the Holocaust, but what happens on the side of the perpetrators, right? Is that also post-memory? Are things transmitted? I'll say that my personal feeling is that I'd rather use a different word for it myself. That I think partly just for moral reasons, it seems strange to collapse the descendants of the victims with the descendants of the perpetrators. I think there are also differences in the way things are transmitted in victim families and perpetrator families, but there are certainly also a lot of similarities as well, or at least parallels. And this is just a book recommendation if anyone is interested in pursuing this question further. It's a book called My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me, translated from German. It's by a Black German woman named Jennifer Tiga, and it's an incredible story, but absolutely true, who discovered when she was in her late 30s that her grandfather was Amon Goetz, who is the brutal Nazi in the film Schindler's List, right? A real figure. And her grandmother, Jennifer Tiga's grandmother, was the mistress of Amon Goetz. If you've seen Schindler's List, you'll remember Goetz living in his little, villa, and with his mistress. That mistress was Jennifer Tiga's grandmother. They had a child, Jennifer Tiga's mother, who then had a child with an African student who was in Germany, and that's how Jennifer Tiga was born. But she was put up for adoption and didn't know this story until she was in her 30s and discovered it. And discovering the story was in fact incredibly traumatizing for her. Right? All of a sudden, she realized that she had this Nazi legacy that she had never imagined before. Anyway, it's a fascinating story if you want to pursue any of this further. And then final question here is before we move directly into into mouse, and I can also pause after this in case there are any questions or anything anyone wants to talk about. So what do I mean by the art of post-memory? Post-memory, and that was in the title of the lecture for today. Post-memory, as I've tried to argue, is a form of communicative memory, right? A form of this familial memory. But when you turn it into a comic book or into any other kind of text or narrative or film, you're turning it into cultural memory. You're turning it into a kind of art form. So what is this art form? And here I just a short quotation from Hirsch. Second generation fiction, art, memoir, testimony, like Spiegelman's text, are shaped by the attempt to represent the long-term effects of living in close proximity to the pain, depression, and dissociation of persons who have witnessed and survived massive historical trauma. So, right, a return to that question of representation with which I started, but now at a generational remove, right? Not what does it mean for me to represent my own traumatic experience, but what does it mean for me to represent someone else's traumatic experience and the effect that it might have had on me? And that's the kind of question I think that's at the heart of what I would call the art of post-memory. So I'm coming to the final section of the lecture, which is specifically to talk a bit about mouse. But I could pause if there's anything anybody wanted to ask or comment on.
You know, feel free to ask in the chat also, and I will pass it on.
I'm happy to also, keep going. I can stay for a few minutes afterwards if people want to just wait and or ask questions in that format. That's also fine. If we're doing okay at time, but I can certainly keep going if we need to. What do you say?
I think go ahead and keep going, and people
Okay.
can type questions in.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to answer later. So, okay. As you know, Mouse appeared in 2 volumes. The first one was in 1986. The second one was in 1991. He, in fact, did it. He created it serially. So it was appearing sort of chapter by chapter in his in this magazine that he was editing called Raw, which you might have heard of before, sort of avant-garde comics magazine. But it was published in book form in 86 and 91. It was an incredible bestseller. It was a huge critical success. It remains, I think, one of the central texts that we think about when we think about Holocaust literature to this day, and likely as that seems, given that we're talking about a comic book. I think Professor Kaganovsky already told you something about Spiegelman's biography. I'll just note here, he was born in 48 in Stockholm. Remember, Hirsch herself was born in 49 in Romania. So again, a similar generational international kind of experience. This image on the right is from Raw magazine, this kind of very underground, raw, kind of avant-garde comic magazine that he started with Françoise Mouly, who's his wife, also a comic artist. I think she works now for the New Yorker magazine. I want to really focus on the text itself and not so much on the biography. And I guess the overall point that I want to make, it's an argument or account that I want to provide, linking up to what I've just been talking about, is that while it's certainly grounded in history, and it really, right, he did his homework on all levels. I've never heard of anyone identifying particular historical errors or anything like that. It's historically grounded. But really what it does is to work simultaneously as what he calls a survivor's tale. In other words, individual memory, Vladek's story especially, right? The memory of Vladek of the Holocaust. Also as a story of the second generation, communicative memory. In other words, a story of how the story of Vladek was transmitted to him, Art Spiegelman. And then finally, it works as a critical intervention into popular Holocaust memory. And here's where it's a work of cultural memory, but as I would say, a kind of critical work of cultural memory. And I'll try to explain why I think that's the case, but I'll just say that this period when Spiegelman was working on it from like the late 80s to the early 90s, late 70s to the early 90s, excuse me, was precisely the moment when consciousness and memory of the Holocaust was really growing exponentially in the United States, starting in 1978 with a television series called Holocaust, a miniseries, which was really trashy, but had a really huge effect around the world on people's understanding of the Holocaust. up until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, when the Holocaust really became globalized as a kind of memory. And Maus is written right in that important period of transition when it's becoming a kind of globalized memory. But I think he's engaging in critical ways with the form that Holocaust memory would take in that period. I'll try to explain that a little bit more later. But the other thing I want to say is I think what's really important about Maus is not just what he says or the story he tells, but how he tells it, right? So in the short time that we have here, I want to just focus on some of the key elements of his visual and narrative comic style, right? And he writes comics that way, C-O-M-I-X, because he wants to emphasize the mixture of verbal and visual means. That's the way he describes that. And I always emphasize this is a graphic memoir. It's not a graphic novel. A novel implies fictionality generally, and this is not fictional, right? This is a true story based on his father's, the stories that he gathered from his father and historical research. So it's surprising to think of a comic book, again, as not fictional, but it's not fictional, right? It is, in fact, a part of the memoir genre, I would say. Whoops. So as you might have heard already, he did a kind of first sketch of this back in the early 70s, a short comic that he published in 72 called Maus. And you'll see that his style changed a lot from that early period. And I have to say, as interesting as this version is, I'm not sure that it would have worked over the long haul. There's something, I dare say, almost too cartoonish about the way that the mice are drawn here. And I think he changes that figure of the mouse to a more humanized one when we get to the actual books themselves. And to me, that makes a big difference, something we could talk about more. But this just looks to me more cartoonish, if I could put it in those terms, not highly technical. But interestingly, already in this early stage, you can see how he's working with historical images, right? He's working with a historical archive and he's remediating them, right? He's taking photographs, for example, like this really famous one from Margaret Bourke-White of the Liberation of Buchenwald, and he's remediating them. He's redrawing it in another medium. And that's something he does quite a lot throughout the whole series. And I think that's quite interesting. Now, obviously, the first thing that jumps out at you when you read Maus is the animal motif, right? And this has been controversial. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I'm sure you'll get a chance to talk about this more and debate it in your sections, or if you want to talk about it later, that's fine. I mean, I think I have to say, I think it works really well, but it runs some risks. And one of the risks that it runs is that it seems to reproduce the very racialized categories that the Nazis used, right? That German Jews before the Holocaust thought of themselves as German, right? They didn't think of themselves as a different species from the Germans, or Polish Jews thought of themselves as Jewish, but they didn't think of themselves as a different species, right? By using different animals, cats and dogs and pigs and all of the rest, and mice, most importantly, there's a kind of sense in which you run the risk of buying into the racialized categories that the Nazis themselves constructed. But I think he also undermines that at various moments, right? For example, when he's talking about how to draw Françoise, his wife, she's French, but she converted, so what should she be? Or also in the frequent use of masks, right? Sometimes, as in this top left image here, to show that they're trying to pass, right? Pass as Polish in this case and not as Jewish. But in the later volumes, you also see, or at different moments, he depicts himself with the mask. And so one of the things to think about is, why does he sometimes use the mask and not use the mask? What's he trying to get at there, right? What does that indicate about how this animal motif functions? I'll say also, Polish people have not been thrilled to be depicted as pigs. That's another thing that one could debate. One of the obvious and most important motifs of Maus, and one of the things that makes it, I think, a memoir really, is the way it mixes the past and the present. And it does this both in its own narrative techniques, but also it brings out how Vladek himself is living sort of simultaneously in the past and the present, right? So he's talking about a stable that he was forced to clean by the Nazis, and then he turns around and says to Art, "You're dropping on the carpet cigarette ashes. You want it should be like a stable here," right? And so Art Spiegelman uses these kinds of slips, to show how his father is really living in between the past and the present. Or on the top right of the right-hand side, right, he starts to draw Vladek starts to draw for Art this hiding place that he had, right? And he says, just in case, right? So you can see for Vladek, the past is still very present and could repeat itself at any moment. Right, so this movement between the past and the present is really important. But actually, when you look at the narrative, when you look at the narration of Maus, you realize there are at least 3 different levels of narration, right? So there's the story of Vladek in the Holocaust. Then there's the story of Art getting Vladek's story, like on the right-hand side on the top, how right, with his recorder recording Vladek's story. That's level 2. And then if you look on the left-hand side, there's level 3, which is Art trying to turn that recording that he got from Vladek into the book that we will be holding, Maus. That's level 3, the struggle to actually create the work, not just to gather the material, but to create it. And then I think there's a 4th level. If you look at the very top where it says, and so, right? There's somebody outside, there's another kind of narrative level outside of that. So there's actually 4 different levels, at least, of narration going on. And that would be interesting, of course, to look at more closely if you get a chance. I talked about the comic style, the mixture of words and images. The words are so compelling that I sometimes find when I'm reading it that I skip over the images almost, right? That you very quickly forget it's about mice and cats. And you hear the voice of Vladek, which is very well done, very powerful, very evocative. And the story is compelling. And so you start to forget even sometimes that this is really also a visual work. And yet there's a lot going on visually. And so I love this example on the left-hand side. It's just a kind of individual thing. I don't know quite what to make of it even, but here you see the Spiegelman family during the war, sitting around the dinner table. And this is Vladek, this is Anja, and this is Rishu. So it's really significant because this is the other son, the first son who dies in the Holocaust, the ghost brother. I think as Art calls him. And what you see unfold here is a silent narrative where Rishu is sitting here at the table, he spills his dinner, his mother gets upset and starts to yell at him, he starts to cry, and then she starts to comfort him, right? And all of that is done while there's this whole dialogue going on, and you can easily miss it. But just an example of how he's sometimes using the visual contrapuntally, right, in counterpoint to the images and telling a different story just through images. He also, as you know, and I gave this example before, uses a lot of visual puns. So here you have smoke coming out of the chimney, which is actually really the smoke coming out of Art's cigarette. And if you've ever heard an interview with Spiegelman, he is a chain smoker and you can hear him smoking constantly. So the way he represents himself in the book is not an exaggeration. He's always, at least he used to always have a cigarette in his hand. But this kind of visual punning is very particular to the book. And along with those kind of visual puns, I think what's really characteristic for me and what I really love about this book is its use of humor. Right? It tells a very serious story. I don't think it trivializes or minimizes the Holocaust in any way at all. And yet it's funny. He uses Black humor and he's very self-reflexive, right? So here he depicts himself having this conversation precisely about the problem of representation, right? Can I really tell this story about my father in a comic strip? How could I possibly do that? What was I thinking? You know, and then Francois says, just keep it honest, honey. And then he says, see what I mean? In real life, you'd never have let me talk this long without interrupting. She says, light me a cigarette, right? So he kind of breaks is it the fourth wall? Is that what we say, right? He kind of addresses us directly in a certain sense, breaks out of the realistic narrative and shows us that he knows that we know that the whole thing is a kind of staging and a representation. Or, for example, when he goes to meet his therapist has all these cats and dogs, including like framed pictures of them, and he says, you know, his place is overrun with stray dogs and cats. Can I mention this, or does it completely louse up my metaphor, right? So again, directly addressing us as the audience, showing us the artificiality of what he's doing. And it is artificial, right? It's a depiction, it's a representation, and yet it still somehow is conveying something very powerful at the same time. And part of what it's conveying is certainly trauma and traumatic histories, and particularly Vladek's trauma. And I'm struck by things like, again, the way it kind of breaks out of the frame there on the left-hand side, where, Vladek makes this Hitler-like gesture, and then the pills spill out of the frame, right? There's something going on there, I think, about a traumatic disruption. Or on the right-hand side, and here's what I meant about going back to that Eva Hoffman quote about the transmission of memory in nonverbal forms, right? So we have Francoise and Art sitting outside here, and you hear this screaming, and Francoise says, "What is that?" And Art says, "Oh, it's just Vladek." He says, "When I was a kid, I thought all grown-ups did this when they were asleep," right? And so you see that things have been transmitted to Art, even though in fact he tells us that he'd never even heard the story more than once before he started collecting it for this book, right? But it was transmitted to him in these other forms through the nightmares that his father was always experiencing, the sounds that he produced there. Now, I know I've just got a couple more minutes. I'll try to finish up quickly in the time that we have. But one of the things that I said at the beginning of this mouse section was that I think that this could be understood as a kind of critical take on the cultural memory of the Holocaust. And one of the reasons I say that is because I think it disrupts our sentimentalized image of the Holocaust survivor, especially, right? We have a sense that people who have gone through terrible events, like Vladek certainly has, should be somehow ennobled by that, or should somehow be represented as innocent and what have you, as just sort of suffering innocent victims. That's not what Spiegelman does, as you know, right? Again and again, he shows us that Vladek wasn't really that great of a guy in some ways. I mean, he's very, you have a lot of respect for him and his ability to survive and all of this stuff, but you also realize he's kind of a jerk at times, right? He's kind of a cheap bastard, as they say, on the left-hand side. And Spiegelman worries, he's like, "I'm worried that I'm going to depict my father as this kind of anti-Semitic caricature." And they say, "Well, you just got to do your best. You got to depict him as he really is." Or on the right-hand side, this very disturbing scene where you see that that Vladek is also kind of a racist. And a lot of survivors make this point. I think it's a really important one. Going through a terrible event does not make you a better person. Auschwitz was not a school, right? It did not teach you human rights and respect for others and tolerance. That's not what a concentration camp or an extermination camp was about. But I think that often gets filtered out of our depictions of events like the Holocaust. And Spiegelman doesn't filter it out. And I think that's really, really powerful. And he also doesn't filter out his own shortcomings and his own limitations. And so I love this scene at the very end of the first chapter where his father says, "Okay, I've just told you this story about my youthful love affairs, but you can't include this in your book." And Spiegelman says, okay, I promise I won't. And then of course he does. He does include it, but he also tells us that he's betraying his father. He shows himself promising not to tell the story, even as he tells the story, right? And of course, at the end of the first volume, you get this, again, disturbing, powerful scene where he calls his father a murderer, right? He calls his father a murderer because he's thrown out his mother's diaries. And he's angry, and you can understand his anger, but he's also showing himself not in a good light, right? Not in a positive light. And I think that ability to bring nuance and complexity into the depiction, both of the survivor and also of the child of survivors himself, the self-portrait, is really, to me, quite important. I need to finish, Let me just...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so just quickly, the last things I want to talk about, and you'll have the slides, and hopefully you'll have time in your sections to talk more about this. I think there's an interesting gendered story to be told here, right? This primarily is the story of Vladek, but it's also the search for Anja's story. What would that story have been, and how would that have been different? At a certain moment, we also hear that Mala, the second wife, has her own story. And Art is not particularly interested in it, even though it parallels his own mother's story so closely. And so there's a question about gendering, right? Whose story gets told, whose story doesn't get told? And would that story have been different from the perspective of a woman and from the perspective of a man? It's actually something that's a lot debated within Holocaust studies, how much gender differences matter, but I think they do. Another part that, of course, is sort of remarkable is the comic within the comic of Prisoner of the Hell Planet. Here's just the scene leading up to it. And then you get this. And I wanted to focus for 1 second on this image, because here is where I think you get the notions of familial and affiliative post-memory brought together so quickly. So here's one of the places where he uses a photograph. You've got Art's mother holding his, patting him on the head. Then you've got a drawn image within Prisoner on the Hell Planet, which was a real comic that he actually did publish earlier. His hand holding that photograph. So again, familial post-memory is here. And then again, his hand again repeated, holding now the whole comic book. And then I think you have to imagine, I don't know if most of you are reading this in a digital form, but if you had the actual books, your hand would be essentially in the place of Art's hand right here as you were holding the book. So there are really four hands at work. And what you get then is both this, we're a transmission across generations, and then from the family out to the reader who is not a family member, but is still somehow now connected to the story by virtue of holding this book in a certain sense and reading this story. And finally, another place where I would talk about his critical take on the cultural memory of the Holocaust is this section in Time Flies, where he talks about how his book has been an incredible critical and commercial success. Volume 1, in other words, is now Volume 2. People want to make a movie about it, right? They want to, all these foreign editions are coming out. And he's commenting in a critical way on his own success and on this whole idea that you can make money from somebody else's trauma, right? Certainly, I don't think any of us wish he hadn't told this story, but it does raise interesting ethical questions, right, about what it means to commodify a traumatic history, to give it this canonical place in cultural memory. Mouse, you've read the book, now buy the vest, as this enterprising cat says here. The photographs are important. They're important also in Hirsch's discussion of post-memory, as I mentioned. And finally, I think the other place where I love what Spiegelman does is the very end, where you seem to attain some sort of closure. You've got this gravestone there with Vladek and Anja's names and dates. It sort of seems, and his own signature below with the dates for which he was working on the volume, 13 years. It seems to give you this incredible closure. Vladek himself says, "We lived happy, happy ever after." And then Vladek says, the last line of the book, "I'm tired from talking, Richelieu, and it's enough stories for now." So the ghost brother reappears. And in some ways shows to us, I think, that you don't actually attain closure for a story of trauma, because the haunting continues, right? The haunting of this brother who did not make it out of the war is still as present, or even more present for Vladek, as the son who's standing in front of him. It's a kind of tragic ending in a way. It's a haunting ending for sure, but it kind of refuses the closure that the book sort of heads toward. And I think that's also a powerful statement and a critical statement about memory and how memory is transmitted. So I'll stop there. I know I went a little over, I apologize for that. But happy to stick around if people want to.